sorry about that. So this is my domain wall state, and I write it on the blackboard because whenever I will write psi naught will be this state. And I time evolve with the Hamiltonian of the XXZ spin chain, which I wrote this. So SZ, where the S are the usual, up to some push factor, the usual Pauli matrices. So this is a well-studied chain. It's integrable. It's exactly solvable. Yes, infinite long. Yes. Actually, with the method I use, I can't even say anything about finite system. So this will be infinite from the start. Kind of. So this problem has been studied quite a bit. So it was first considered in the particular case of delta equals 0. So when delta equals 0, you can map this Hamiltonian through a Jordan-Wigner transformation onto a free Fermi chain. And then computation become much more easy. And this was studied in this paper by Antal, Rakos, and Schütz back in '99. If you want to study the full interacting case, well, until recently, you had to rely on numerical techniques. So, for example, DMRG. So you can do the time evolution with some DMRG algorithm if you want. And actually, in the first paper that implemented time-dependent DMRG for quantum systems, studied this exact quench as an example of application of the numerical method. Now, a bit about the physics. So, what do you get when you do that? So, obviously, if I'm far on the left, the state with all spins up is an eigenstate of the XXZ Hamiltonian. So I don't expect anything to happen. It's the same on the right. So if you think of some short time behavior, the only thing that can happen will be near the center. Okay? So this is what you expect. And over time, there will be a non-trivial density profile where, so if you want magnetization 1/2 means all the spins are up, here all the spins are down, and in between there will be some non-trivial density profile. So I need to explain what kind of limit I have in mind. And so the limit I have in mind is a hydrodynamic limit, where, so x is my position on the chain. So my sites are labeled by, let's say, integers, and x is an integer. But I look at large x, so x is much larger than the lattice spacing, if you want. I look at time very large, but I keep x over t finite. So this is the limit of interest, where you get this beautiful density profile, which is given by a very simple question. So, simple function, sorry. So, this is an example of a DMRG simulation. So, there are the black dots at time 50, the green crosses at time 100. And you can see that if I rescale everything as a function of x over t, the two numerical curves collapse nicely into a single curve, which means the density is really a function of x over t. Okay? And in red, I put an exact formula for the density profile in that limit. So where does this exact formula come from? It comes from a recent breakthrough in the field of quantum quenches and hydrodynamic descriptions of such problems. So like a year ago, or almost 2 years ago now, some generalized hydrodynamic approach was put forward in these two nice papers. So they consider their framework applies only to the case where delta is less than 1, where you have ballistic transport. So by ballistic, since x over t is finite, it means the front, for example, if you think of this point or this point, the point where the magnetization starts to become non-trivial, spreads as t. So this is ballistic behavior. X over t goes like t. Okay? And for this particular quench, there is actually this generalized hydrodynamic can be fully solved, actually. And this has been done more recently, and where the density profile was computed. And so this is the exact formula. You see it's relatively simple. You see there is a dependence on x over t in that limit. So only in that limit. If I don't take the limit, then it's much more complicated. And I parameterize the anisotropy delta as cosine pi, a ratio of two integers. So this is the parameterization. And if you look in the eye this formula, it's very weird because you can see that P and Q appear in different places in this formula. So you see here there is sine pi P over Q, which looks normal, but here there is a sine pi over Q, there is no P, and here there is a Q in prefactor. So if you look at this formula, it means actually that the density profile is nowhere continuous as a function of delta. So that's the surprising fact, and I will have something to say about this in the following. Of course, if I look at a finite position and finite time, density is a continuous function. It only becomes nowhere continuous when I go to this hydrodynamic limit, x large, t large, x over t finite. Another interesting question, I think, what is an interesting issue is what happens at delta equals 1. So at delta equals 1, it was shown by numerical simulation that the spreading of correlation is not ballistic anymore. It goes slower than t, so x over t goes slower than t. And it was recently conjectured that the exponent looks bigger than 0.5 if you do numerics. And it was conjectured in this paper that the exponent might be, so they find in this paper, they find 0.6, and they hope it's 3/5 because that would be, well, kind of a cool exponent, I guess. Okay, so, and I will have something to say about that also. So in this talk, so this is the setting, and I will do something even more specific than density profile, because what I want is to make, this is the limit I'm after, but I want to make a computation that's exact at all times also. And it turns out you can do it for a very specific observable, which is the return probability. So the return probability is simply the overlap between the time-evolved wave function with the wave function at time 0. Okay? So I will show that in this integrable xxz, if I evolve this initial state with the integrable xxz Hamiltonian, then you can get an exact formula for this quantity. And perhaps others, but that's the only one I have so far. If you think of ballistic transport, you might make a guess as at what happens at large time. So usually an overlap, if you think of overlap between, let's say, two wave function in a spin chain of size, let's say L, then you expect that the overlap is exponentially small in the size of the system. That's what happens generically. And since I showed you these pictures here, well, you might think of, if you make the overlap with the initial state here, well, then at large time, the overlap will be trivial here, because all the spins are up, so I will pick up a bunch of ones. Here I will pick up one for the overlap. And in between, I have some system of size t. And so if I have a system of size t, I might think the exponential, the overlap will be exponentially small in t. That's a reasonable guess. And actually, I put of the order or smaller, because there might be something, there could be actually some problem with this argument. And the overlap could be potentially smaller, because what you need to keep in mind is that I have a time-evolved phase, time-evolved state, sorry. There are a bunch of phases everywhere, and there could be some miraculous constellation that would make it smaller. And actually, this will happen, so that's why I'm putting this. Another remark is the case delta larger than 1, where actually there is no transport at all. So when delta is larger than 1, there is a little bit of dynamics at short time, but after a while it freezes and doesn't do anything. And this is consistent with an exact result that was derived for this return probability in the case delta larger than 1, where basically the overlap saturates to some constant value. There are a bunch of oscillations, but it saturates to some constant value, which means nothing happens, essentially. And the point of this talk is so this is delta larger than 1, and the point is to study the case which delta less than 1 or delta equals 1, which is more challenging. Okay, so this is what I am after. But before doing that, so there will be an exact computation, but this exact computation can be nicely illustrated with pictures, so I can't resist showing them. And I apologize for those who have seen them already many times. So you can consider a seemingly completely different problem. I just give you the square lattice. And I want to pave this with dimer. So what is a dimer? Dimer is just some link on the lattice that is occupied by this green thing, which is a dimer. And the rule is that each site, okay, so a dimer occupies a link or two sites if you want. Each site has to be occupied by one dimer and one dimer only. So I can put a bunch of them. So here I have some weird color codes. So basically, I give you the reason for the colors. So I distinguish between horizontal and vertical dimers. Okay, so I have two different colors. And for each type of horizontal or vertical dimers, I put a different color depending on, let's say, the parity of the. If I label my site by integers, the parity of the label. So it's just a way to distinguish between even and odd sublattice, if you want. And the only reason I do that is to make the picture look nicer. Okay, so for example, this is one dimer covering of this lattice, okay? And there are many, many, many. You can even count them exactly, but that's not the point here. So this is what the dimer covering looks like. Let me remove the lattice. So I have this. So this is 8 by 8, I think. You can show a dimer covering at random on the 64, I think it's 64 by 64. And this is 500 by 500. And if you go that, it looks complicated. And actually, this is a simple example of a 2D statistical mechanical model that's described by some conformal field theory in Euclidean conformal field theory. So and so for example, if you compute the correlations between dimers and a dimer here and a dimer here, very far apart, they decay algebraically. So this is a critical system. And so the correlations are very well known and understood now. So this has lots of names. So in the mathematical literature, this is usually called Gaussian free field. You might have heard of Coulomb gas also. So for me, this is more a free compact CFT. Or if you want, it's an Euclidean version of the Luttinger liquid that describes 1D quantum system. Okay, so why am I doing that? Actually, I don't want to do that. I want to do something slightly different. I want to play the same game on this peculiar lattice here, which is called an Aztec diamond. Okay, so let me do the same. I put dimers. And I show you one configuration at random. I remove the lattice, and this is once again 8 by 8. And the fun thing that happens is that if you look at the very, very, very large lattice, you see this happening. So here I showed you, out of the many, many, many configurations, one that I chose at random. Okay? And what you see is that this has a nice circle shape, where basically all the dimers, so this color means that the dimers here, they are vertical here, horizontal here. So it means that if I take a very, very large lattice with probability 1, the dimers will be effectively frozen outside of what looks like a circle, and that actually can be proven to be a circle. This is called the Arctic circle theorem. And so circle because circle, and Arctic because the dimers, they are frozen. So that's a good way to sell, I guess, this paper. Okay, so this is, and so and we studied similar systems a while back trying to study the long-range correlations, because there are also correlation decay also algebraically, but since the system is not homogeneous, it's a bit more complicated than the usual stuff. And so we studied this, and what I forgot to say is that this model, if you want, is still free fermion, so it can be mapped, the pure combinatorial dimer model can be mapped onto free fermions. So this is technically.
Inside it remains a free field?
Yes, inside it remains a Gaussian free field. Well, if you were at Jérôme Dubai's talk last week, this is inhomogeneous Gaussian free field inside. Yes, but the tricky part is that it's inhomogeneous, so it has been slightly less studied, at least in condensed matter or StatMech literature. Okay, and so this is free, but you can also add interactions. So for example, here I did a simulation where I add attractive interaction between the dimers. So which means that if I have a plaquette like this, I favor parallel dimers. Okay, and you see that the same phenomenon occurs, but the curve, so if you want in the thermodynamic limit, the curve that separates the frozen region from the fluctuating region is different. So it changed, and okay, so that's it. And if I do repulsive interactions, I get a slightly different picture. So, okay, so why am I showing these pictures? Because in the exact computation I will do, the same phenomenology will occur. But since I'm interested in XXZ spin chain, I won't do dimers. I will study the 6-vertex model, which is very similar, which is not exactly the same model, but very, very similar. And so this is the 6-vertex model. So there are 6 types of vertices, which I show here with different weights. Okay. Here I choose that A1 equals A2 equals A, B1 equals B2 equals B, C1 equals C2 equals C. And so at the bottom here, it's a representation in terms of arrows, but you can also represent the same model with passes that are shown in blue here. Okay. And this is the usual parameterization of the weight that I will need in the following. And you see that this anisotropy parameter I had shown before, delta, is a combination of these 3 weights. So this is the 6-vertex model. And an observation that you can make is that if you think of some transfer matrix description of this 6-vertex model, and let's say you try to impose this boundary condition. So there is an exact relation between the spins and the occupations of the if you want the vertices weights. And if you impose this boundary condition at the bottom, you will exactly do what is shown in blue here. So all the spins up mean I put this here, and I put nothing on the right, and I impose the same at the top. Okay. If I do that, due to just the rules that are 2 in 2 out, because I have only 6 types of vertices. If I do that, so this is what I showed in blue is if you want the effect of this state, and in black are all the degrees of freedom that are completely frozen, but automatically. Just if you want to satisfy the vertices rule. If you don't see it, just believe me. This will be automatically, just by construction, frozen, and here the same. And the point is that if you do the exercise, so here I'm not really doing the exercise, but the point is that what happens is that this actually artificially forms something that looks very much like this Aztec diamond I showed you. And actually, if you think of some large limit, there will be also an Arctic curve. So I drew a circle here that will separate a region where the vertices fluctuate from a region where the vertices do not. Okay, so there is there is just a slight technicality that I showed the different weights that the vertices had, and there is a peculiar limit of this. So if I now look at the partition function of this model, there is actually a peculiar limit of this partition function that will give me the return probability I am after. And so a way to illustrate this is that if some of the weights I rescale, so before the weights B were 1. So what I forgot to say is that I put A equals 1. Okay, C is fixed, B equals 1 here, and C is fixed by delta. So I do that. If I make B twice as small, but I multiply by 2 the number of vertical steps, I get also some kind of Aztec diamond, but that's changed a bit shape. And if you think again of some very large system, the curve that separates the fluctuating region from the frozen region has changed a little bit. Okay, and the whole point of this procedure is to try to make the limit B goes to 0. So this is called sometimes Hamiltonian or Trotter limit. If I send B to 0 in this fashion, then I will get a model that is discrete on this line, if you want, but continuous in the vertical direction, but still well defined. And I will still have a curve that separates region where all, if you want, the spins here are up, all the spins are down here, and here they fluctuate. Okay, and the point is that this limit is exactly computes exactly this, where psi naught is my initial state, and I evolve now with e to the tau h, where tau is assumed to be real for now. Okay, so this, if you want, I mean, it's not so easy to see from the picture, perhaps, but this is just a mathematical identity. So if I take the partition function of this 6-vertex model like this on this geometry, and I take this limit, so a limit where b goes to 0. So if you want, I send the the size of the system. So this is n. If you want, is always the size of this thing. If I send the size of the system to infinity, but I rescale b, I made by n. So b becomes very, very small, and n goes to infinity. This limit is finite and gives me exactly the return probability I want it, except that tau is real, but it's not a big deal as we see. Okay, and why am I doing all this thing? Well, I'm doing this because the partition function on the discrete lattice for the 6-vertex model is known exactly since very long ago, actually. Now it's 30 years. So it was first considered by Koryepin, and in 87, Izergin found an exact determinant formula for this, which is given by this. So it's a complicated-looking formula, which is the determinant, but it's fully explicit. And here, the parameter epsilon and gamma, they are related to this A, B, C, and delta. If you want. So this is completely explicit. And if I want my return probability, well, I just have to take the limit I was showing here. However, it's not completely obvious how you do this. Because in this limit, so if you want here, I have epsilon. So if you want in this limit, epsilon will become very small, n will become very large. And so if you look at this formula, you will see that the prefactor becomes very, very small, very, very fast. The size of the determinant goes to infinity, and the matrix element go also themselves to infinity. So it's a bit nasty looking, but there are, from integrability literature, there are known ways to do that. And the way is to use orthogonal polynomials, which I will explain in one slide. So what I forgot to say is that if you look at this matrix element, so I, j labels the rows and columns of the determinants, it only depends on I plus j. Okay? So such determinants, they are called Hankel determinants, and they are very peculiar and nice properties. And one is the relation to orthogonal polynomials. So let me just explain this. So imagine you construct some set of orthogonal polynomial for some scalar products, so which I wrote here. So the scalar product between f and g is some integral weighted by weight function w. Okay, so I can always construct a set of orthogonal polynomials for this scalar product. This I can always do. Here I ask that they are monic. So monic just means that if you want pk of x, the leading coefficient is 1. That's just what monic means. So I do that. I have my nice orthogonal polynomial, and I consider the Hankel matrix given just by the moments of x, I plus j. So the matrix element, they are just integral x I plus j times w of x. And that's it. If I have such a matrix, then you can show that the determinant is just given by this coefficient here that enter the normalization of this set of orthogonal polynomials. So it's an extremely simple formula. Usually determinant is horrible, and here there is a very nice simplification. And even better, you can get the inverse also. And so the inverse looks a bit more complicated, but basically it's constructed from what's called the Christoffel-Darboux kernel, which involves these orthogonal polynomials. So that means that if I give you a Hankel matrix, you want to compute the determinant, is very easy. You just need to know these factors, okay? And if you want to compute the inverse, you can also compute it explicitly. Of course, when I say easy, it's provided I can construct explicitly the orthogonal polynomials. If I can't, then I just mapped a complicated problem into a complicated problem. But there are nice cases where this is optimal. And one case I can show is the case delta equals 0. So when delta equals 0, it was pointed out already a while ago that you can construct explicitly those polynomials, and which means that in the end the partition function can be computed just, so the determinant I showed before becomes just a product of very simple factors, and in the end that's what you get. So at the free fermion point where delta equals 0, or if you want a square plus b square equals c square, so this is delta equals 0. Well, the partition function is just given by this ridiculously simple formula, which is not so easy to show, but it's ridiculously simple in the end. And if I do my limit here, well, I can just plug b equals tau over n. I send the limit, and this is a high school algebra that this limit converges to exponential tau square over a. So which means at the free fermion point, actually what I want to compute is given by this formula, which is valid for any tau. So any tau, it can be even complex, this works.
But you can deduce the shape from this? Or
No, it's not enough to get the shape. But it's consistent because it scales at tau square, and if you think of free energy, the log of the partition function is the free energy, and it should scale like the area of the region, which is proportional to tau square. And this is related to several interesting problems, some of which go back to very, very long ago. Okay, so this is a simple example. If delta is non-zero, then this becomes more complicated. And you can compute this limit using Laguerre polynomials. So one way to do it is to use Laguerre polynomials. So the weight for the Laguerre polynomials is just exponential, and I take this on the positive real line. Okay, and this, if you have this weight, then the corresponding Hankel matrix, the determinant is just given by this formula. And why do I do that? Well, I do that because this was exactly, if you want, almost exactly the prefactor I had in front of my determinant before. And so this means I can rewrite my partition function like this. Okay, and the trick is that now this is the Hankel matrix corresponding to the Laguerre polynomials, and I can invert it. Okay, so now I just use the fact that the ratio of determinants is just that b minus 1a. And if I do that, I can take the limit after I did this manipulation. And then everything becomes finite. Okay, so there are details. Let me skip them. The end result is that you can write this partition function as some simple prefactor times Fredholm determinant with some kernel, which I wrote here. So the kernel v is given by a product of two terms. So one is b, which is a function that can be written with Bessel function. So J naught is the usual Bessel function. J naught prime is the first derivative times a factor like this. So this looks a bit complicated, but it's completely explicit. And let me recall one definition of a Fredholm determinant. So it's a complete analog of a regular determinant, but for operators. So instead of matrix, I have operators. And I can define it through the logarithm. So the logarithm of the determinant is like the trace of log. And this is given by a series of multiple integrals that involve this kernel. So in principle, it's fully explicit, even though computing it might be tricky in some cases, but that's fully explicit.
So the origin is because you had this shape R over B, where B was close to A. That was
B goes to 0, yes. So that's why it becomes continuous in a way.
okay.
Yeah.
It's not A. A is not 1 plus something.
No, so now A is 1.
Large A, the transparency which was just before. Ah oui, c'est ça.
Yes.
Formula.
Yeah, so the point is that they are of the same order if you want. So I use this and I compute this inverse to regularize everything. Okay, so the details don't matter too much, but just a completely exact formula. Maybe I will skip that, but there are other representations that are completely equivalent. where you rewrite the kernel in a slightly different way. So here the prefactor, the extra factor I had before becomes simpler, but the trade-off is that now the kernel in front involves hypergeometric functions. So before I had just Bessel, which was a bit simpler. But okay, that's what it is. And now I come back to this Arctic curve thing. So this in the 6-vertex model, they were computed a few years ago by Colomo and Pronko. And so I show you the end result for the curves corresponding to the partition function I'm computing. So you can see that it changes with delta. There are a few values of delta. And okay, the curve looks like some kind of almost an ellipse. So the expressions are very complicated. They don't even fit in the transparency, but in the end it looks like it kind of looks like an ellipse. And in the limit delta goes to 1, this shrinks to 0. Okay, so this is interpretation. Now I can try to look at the large tau asymptotics of this partition function, and once again you can extract the large tau asymptotics, and there is no big surprise. It scales like the exponential of some coefficient that you can compute times tau square. So for large tau, it still has an interpretation in terms of free energy of some fluctuating region. So there is also a nice power law correction, which I don't really understand, but that is there. Okay, so now this was all clean and well defined, let's say. So now I will do something slightly more crazy, because my motivation is not to compute. My real motivation is to compute this thing. Okay, and before I was computing with tau h, where tau was real. So of course, if you look at this exact formula in the eye, there is actually no problem substituting tau with IT. Everything becomes is still well behaved, even though the kernel decays less fast. It's still well behaved and well defined, which means I can just substitute tau equals IT in my exact formula, and I have an exact formula for this thing, which is the return probability. Okay. And another thing that you can try, which is much less controlled, is to try to look what happens if I do the same substitution to the Arctic curves. So I was telling you there was a region that was frozen and a region that was not. Okay. And if I try to make this analytic continuation of this Arctic curve, I recover exactly, actually. So I showed you at the beginning a density profile that was something like this. Okay. If I make the analytic continuation, you want the continuation of the Arctic curve to give you the points here where the density profile becomes non-trivial. Because here, this is kind of frozen also, all up, all down. And it turns out it works. And so you have, for example, a very simple formula for the front, and this coincides with the result from a hydrodynamic approach I was mentioning in the beginning.
In the inside, you can get it.
No, because I have just the curve. So that's why it's a bit tricky. Yes. And okay, and now we go to the slightly crazy stuff, because I was telling you that the density profile also was nowhere continuous as a function of delta. And so if you look at the large T asymptotics of this return probability, so in tau space, where tau was real, there was no problem. It was just some free energy, well-behaved, nice and easy. And actually, if you look, so the thing is I can't prove it. I can only compute this freedom determinant numerically to insane precision on very, very large times. And you can see that it's, so if I'm at root of unity, so I parameterize delta equals cosine p pi p over q, sorry. Then this goes as t square. So this goes as exponential minus some coefficient times t square, which you might have guessed because I told you before in imaginary time, as a function of tau, it's exponential coefficient times tau square. So you might want to just replace tau by IT and see if this gives the asymptotic. And actually, it turns out it doesn't work. It works only when p equals 1. So when p equals 1, you can just substitute for the large limit. Otherwise, you can't. And you get this crazy-looking formula, which once again, there is q, but there is no p to be seen. And even more weird, if you are away from root of unity, so because And root of unity assumes that cosine that delta is cosine pi times some rational fraction. If you're away from this, then it becomes just exponential. So the return probability is just exponential in t, exponentially small in t. It was exponentially small in t squared before. So if I make a plot, so let me extract, for example, the coefficient of the t square in this exponential, and this is the numerical result. And you can see that, so of course I have only a few points that are accessible with numerics, but you see that this is the function that looks nowhere continuous, and that matches this formula. And of course this fractal behavior is also compatible with the result of generalized hydrodynamics. One motivation for this is that in principle, if you're better than I am at solving Riemann-Hilbert problem, you could even in principle prove it. But even though the formula I'm sure is correct.
This formula is guessed or you calculated? The formula here?
So this is a pure guess. Except I know that when p equals 1, it's not a guess, it comes from imaginary.
For the other one, it's a guess.
Yes. Yes.
So the only p dependence
Is in sine gamma actually. Yes.
Maybe I just lost it. So why, for instance, this formula which is on the top, it's t squared, and on the bottom, when it's no root of unity, it's
So because there is q here, so you might think of irrational number as some limit of rational numbers, where q becomes larger and larger, and this decays as 1 over q actually. So this goes to 0. Sorry, I forgot to mention that, but the coefficient goes to 0. So actually, it makes sense that it becomes t at the end. Which is, by the way, the rough argument I gave you for the decay of this return probability was exponential. So in a generic system, I really think you should get exponentially small in t. Here, there is something weird that happens because the system is integrable, and there are extra cancellation, which makes this probability decay actually much faster than you might have thought. Okay, so now I have 10 minutes. Let me go to possibly the most interesting part. So this is the special case delta equals 1. So when delta equals 1, there are actually some nice simplifications. So you can massage this determinant a little bit, rewrite and rewrite this return probability has a determinant, still a Fredholm determinant, but with some kernel that acts on a finite interval. So before it was acting on the real line. Now it acts only on a finite interval 0 square root of t, where t is time. Okay, so I have this. So this is the exact formula for the kernel, which looks much less nasty than before. It's just some Bessel function times some highly oscillating factor. Okay.
This is a good indication that it's not 3 feet.
Well, exactly, yes. So that's my point. So here you see there is, I wrote it explicitly to make it very apparent that you see only root t's in that formula, which means a good guess is that this return probability is exponentially in root t. But let me get to that. Let me just explain one or two things before. So this is the kernel, and if you think of some large t limit, you might just, for the sake of to understand the argument, rewrite it as like this. So if you want for large argument, you can look at this kernel like this. And now I compute this Fredholm determinant. So the Fredholm determinant is just a bunch of sums of trace of this kernel to the n. Okay. So if I do n equals 1, I'm computing just integral 0 square root of t k of u. Okay. And if you plug v equals u in this formula, well, you get a constant. So basically, you're computing a constant. So k u is constant. So this is of order. This is proportional to root. Okay. Now let me. So this is trace k. Let me do the same with trace k squared because I need, in principle, all of them. Okay. So this is what? This is integral root t integral root t du dv k of uv k of v. Okay. Now if I'm playing uv, I'm integrating in some box that has size root t, and you see this is a highly oscillating function. So you might expect some cancellations that basically everything will fall out quickly, except when u equals v. And u equals v is this diagonal here. Okay? So actually, to evaluate this, this integral, double integral asymptotically in the large T limit, you can actually think that everything will be dominated by this diagonal. And you can actually compute it explicitly by, instead of integrating on this region, you make a change of variables. You rotate, if you want. You make a u plus v over 2, u minus v over 2. You integrate now over this region. And you can compute this explicitly, actually. And since you expect that the integral will be dominated by this region, you don't neglect too much. And this will give you that asymptotically, this will be also proportional to root t. Now, if you do trace k to the cube, you will be integrating on the cube, and it's the same. You will the integration will be dominated by the region where, so you have u v w in the region where will be dominated by the region where u equals v equals w, and so on. Which means each time you will pick up a factor that's proportional to root t. So then this means log det will be some coefficient which you can compute exactly as a zeta or 3/2 times root t. So this gives you for free. I mean, this is a hand-waving argument that this determinant decays as exponential minus root t. Okay. So there is a power law correction which is much harder to guess because the rough argument I gave only gives you this factor, but you can get it even though I can't prove it. But in the calculation you see that this term has to appear. Okay. So this is the exact result, and I checked it also numerically to very high precision. So this is the exact result for this return probability. And now I told you before that if I think of some front that propagates as t to some exponent delta, then the return probability has to be smaller or decay asymptotically smaller than exponential minus some coefficient times t to the delta. So before delta was 1, but now I can apply the same argument with some front that propagates at with some exponent delta I don't know about. If I think of this argument, then this formula here tells me that delta is less than 1/2. Okay, so the simplest argument for the root t. So what do I mean by that? So numerically, I told you that it was found that delta looked a bit bigger than 0.5, possibly 0.6, possibly 3/5. So here, this argument suggests that delta is actually less than 1/2. So the only way to reconcile it is that they overestimated a little bit the exponent, and that delta is actually exactly equal to 1/2, which would be much more natural. So I think, of course, it's not at all a conclusive argument, but I think this strongly suggests that transport at delta equals 1 after this quench should be diffusive. So the front should spread as root t. And actually, with this formula, you can also play around with, imagine I just know how to compute this return probability numerically, and I want to guess the exponent of t in this formula. So I take the log of this return probability, and I try to estimate just numerically, without knowing the result, this exponent. So if I do that naively, so for times up to, like, let's say, the largest times that are available by DMRG, I will see an exponent that looks quite a bit bigger than 0.5. So here, the biggest system I can do is like 0.56 or something. So just my point is that if I do that, I tend to overestimate the exponent. But if I knew before that there was this correction here, and I cancel it out by multiplying by t to the minus 1/2, I do the same fit, then the exponent looks much smaller. So the only point is that when you have potentially tricky correction like this, naive fit like was done in the original paper is very, very risky, and probably you end up completely overestimating the exponent. Sorry. And similar, so this was studied with DMRG by Grégoire, Jérôme, and Paul very recently, and they did it. They pushed it to the maximum time you can humanly access, at least for now. And they computed magnetization and current, taking care of potential corrections, and then, well, they see that it should be 0.5, or at least very, very close to 0.5. And let's say 5 minutes, so I want to just So I told you that the argument I had for this return probability was not completely conclusive. But of course, the reason I'm pushing it is that if you think of some exact computation at finite time, this is the only quantity I can compute so far, and it looks a bit complicated already. But there is another one I think that can be computed, which is a generalization of this return probability. So it's called emptiness formation probability. So it's just with my time evolved wave function, it's just if you want the probability that all the spins. So I had my infinite line before, so this is 0. I have a bunch of sites. And I compute, let's say, the probability that all the spins are up in this region. So this is x, if you want. So I compute so 1 plus sigma jz over 2 is a projector onto the up state for the Pauli matrices. And I just compute this emptiness formation probability. So in particular, if x equals 0, this is exactly the return probability I was talking about. Because this will be just a projector onto the domain wall state. So this, I don't know if you see, but that's what you get. So the point is that this is a generalization of this return probability. And here I have some spatial resolution. Because when imagine I look at a short time after the quench, and I'm looking at this emptiness formation probability where x is very far to the left, then I will find 1, because all the spins, they are in up state. Okay? So this observable, it should see some spatial structure, and it should see at least the front. Okay? So if I compute this, I will get some information. Basically, if you want, I will get some information on the relation between x and t. So for large x, large t, I should see if I see x over root t, x over t to the 3/5, or something like this. So in principle, if you can compute this, you're done. You can settle the question of transport, I think. So it's easier said than done. So there are exact formula for this emptiness formation probability in the 6-vertex model side, but then you have to go through all these limits that I showed before, and it's more complicated than what I showed. I think it's doable, but it's not that.
You have to go through a finite chain.
Yes, because you have to take this Hamiltonian limit once again, and then it's more nasty than, because here it was just a determinant, and now it becomes more complicated. But in principle, you could hope to do that. And so one example of expected behavior, at least at root of unity, is that this decays for large time as some scaling function of x over t times t squared. Okay, and where this function vanishes, where this function, so because I want the probability to be 1 here and 0 here. So if you think of this f of x over t, this function should vanish exactly at the position of the front in case of ballistic transport. And at delta equals 1, if I can compute this and compute the asymptotic, then I think I will see what are the transport properties. So this is the goal of my life, if you want, right now. Let me perhaps conclude.
What you showed, there is a part which is some kind of x over t behavior.
Yes, there is a part where, so basically there is a part where e is basically 1. Then it's exponential in t squared, but the t squared doesn't really matter here. What matters is the scaling function of x over t in case of ballistic transport. And I think I will see some scaling function of x over root t at the Heisenberg point. At least that's, yes, so that's the hope. Or maybe I will see 3/5 and then I'm wrong. But I will see, I will be able to answer. So let me conclude. So I presented you, so I studied a very specific quench. I showed you an exact formula for one quantity, but it's exact at all time. And in the literature, there are very, very few of them. So that was one of the motivation, especially to have it finite at all times. So for large time, you can sometimes make guesses or have some hydrodynamic description, but at finite time, it's usually extremely complicated. So I was happy to find this. Even though you get some crazy nowhere continuous behavior, this calculation has a nice interpretation, I think, in terms of this Arctic circle phenomenology I showed you before. Or at least in the calculation, you can see the circle evolving. Then you do this analytic continuation and weird stuff happens. So of course, the fact that the analytic continuation does not commute with the large tau or t behavior is not such a big surprise in principle because it's known as Stokes phenomenon. The asymptotics of the function can depend on where you look at in the complex plane. But this is a nice example where this occurs rather spectacularly. And I think I showed some strong or good, I don't know, evidence for diffusive behavior. At least there is the only exact result known so far where you see root t somewhere in some formula. And of course, this is specific to this initial state, so it would be nice to be able to say something about other states where possibly you could get different behavior. And with that, I thank you. So I don't know. So it's not completely clear to me. This will be the same emptiness because so here the thing is that there is a I don't know. So there is a square hidden in this formula because if you want the product of 1 plus sigma jz over 2 is if you want I can rewrite as a projector. All the spins up. Okay, it's actually a bit more complicated than that. But what I mean is that you have to think of this as some projector. So there is a square hidden in this formula, so it's not completely clear what you would call emptiness formation probability in SEP would be exactly this.
But ça va dans le même sens. Tout à l'heure, you mentioned some Derrida-Gershenfeld result.
Yes, but there is no square in their formula, so it's really the.
So why do you use this formula? You didn't use this formula.
No, actually, I didn't realize oh, sorry. Yes, sir. So I didn't realize this connection until Paul sent me an email mentioning that there was probably the exact same formula in SEP. Okay. But it's really, I mean, it's really just at the level of the partition function. So, I mean, this, if you want tau h, so sorry, this is psi naught. But this is what you get in SEP. But then if you really compute an observable, you have to insert something somewhere in this correlator. So it's not completely clear to me this would exactly correspond to SEP.
Peut-être c'est une réponse, mais for me, SEP, you have one of psi 0 must be replaced by something trivial. Because you compute quelque chose de linéaire dans le système.
Yes.
It would be one to the left and psi 0 to the right. Quand on calcule des probabilités, c'est l'état de gauche. You know, you have
a
matrix, and so left state is a trivial state, just sum of all the configurations.
No, I see, but it's not completely clear to me. It's the exact same quantity.
What I mean by the formula in red here is a probability that you have zero current inside.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So there could be a question related to your emptiness probability is that I have a zero current starting from -x.
Yes.
And if it's the case, it would be useful to compute it at the end for the set complex. Would it help you to?
In principle, yes. If it's the same thing, yes. But
work on equation of that set, with Baruch and Sasora, and so, but that we call it void formation probability. But we started with really initial condition set, and then we just ask when it becomes with probability at time t that we could find it, but large like hydrodynamic.
But this has not been computed in the literature so far, right? Maybe it's too, but I think it's doable in the same sense that the calculation I was advertising, because in the end, so in the special case delta equals 1, with a very, very different method, I find the same result. and which is just, so for me, I'm based on algebraic Bethe-Ansatz, if you want, and this is coordinate Bethe-Ansatz. So in the end, it has to fit. But yeah, I think the two problems, they have the same complexity, just which paths to choose. Maybe one is simpler than the other. I don't know which one.
Depends on your
Depends on
habits.
this. Yes, also. Yeah. But at least with this imaginary time Arctic business, I have a clear way to at least see what I have to do. Then I manage or I do not. But
I can, in SEP, I have the impression whatever you do is linear in the probability, in the wave function. The wave function is a probability, each configuration, and you never compute squares.
so that was why I thought it might not be the same. But maybe we have to chat a bit about this.
This one, current,
No, c'est pas le même courant. I don't think it's.
I mean, this formula for RT is a formula for having a zero current.
Yes, but if I put a finite current, then this does not correspond to any quantum current through the middle.
Cette formule, elle est connue.
The simplest would be to check the average current, because for SEP is absolutely trivial, it's just square root of t divided by pi, just a function. But for here, for instance,
It's not
you can
that
check-
simple. Yes.
It's not that simple in quantum XXXK for sure. But that I presume it would be different entity. You know. So no, it's quite a miracle that those
Yeah.
two numbers coincide.
Yes.
Right?
And what I want to emphasize is that I didn't explain this, but in this calculation, at least on the side I was considering, you really see that it's more complicated. I mean, you see that before it was, so I think it's still doable, but the amount of work is significantly more involved.
For that
Yeah.
calculation, you just what you write here, you mostly think about ballistic case.
No, but it should be true for any value of delta. So in principle, I can compute this for. Yes. Yes.
Second
Yeah. This is for example for ballistic, and I think I should see some x over root t in case.